So welcome. Welcome to everyone joining us from Europe, North America, and beyond. We are delighted to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence through this transatlantic conversation. Organized by America Europe Fund at KU Leuven in partnership with the College of Europe and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I will be moderating. I'm Dr. Catherine Nash, and it is my pleasure to invite Ambassador Dirks to offer the opening welcome. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Good afternoon, dear guests, dear friends, dear professors. The U.S. Declaration of Independence always resonates somewhat, and for example, these days in several European capitals, festive celebrations are organized, mostly by U.S. embassies. Yesterday, for example, I was attending the one in Brussels, which I personally found rather spectacular, with almost 9,000 people in physical attendance. But in welcoming you on behalf of the America Europe Fund of KU Leuven, I wanted to say that it was also very important for the University of Leuven, to mark 250 years of American history. And I can tell you that the university is learning what the history means as it turned itself 600 years. We are particularly honored to organize this event together with the partners that you already mentioned, Kathy, the College of Europe in Bruges and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in the Tufts University. And I think their partnership, our partnership, reflects very well the purpose of today's dialogue, to bring together leading academics from both sides of the Atlantic to reflect upon one of the defining political documents of modern history. And for the America Europe Fund at KU Leuven, this event also embodies its own mission, because since its creation, it's now 6 years ago, we try to strengthen the intellectual ties between the United States of America and Europe by promoting dialogue, academic exchange, offering new programs for students at master level, and a deeper understanding of the transatlantic relationship. And at the time when this relationship is being tested, we think that academic debate across the Atlantic is perhaps more valuable than ever. And also, I think it's important to show that we all remain open as universities to each other. So we will continue our work in that transatlantic spirit, and hope to launch very soon one of our ongoing projects, which is the a massive online course on the relationship between Europe and the United States. So today we're very privileged, I think, to have such an exceptional panel with us, and I would like to thank most sincerely each and every one of you for your time, for sharing your experience and insights on this historic occasion. And with that, let me hand it back to you, Catherine, and wishing everybody a very thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wouters. The U.S. Declaration of Independence is often associated with the American break from British rule, but its significance extends far beyond 1776. It has shaped constitutional thought, inspired democratic and anti-colonial movements, and influenced political developments across the Atlantic and across the world. So today, as we approach the 250th anniversary, we have, as Ambassador Wouters indicated, an exceptional panel to reflect on its historical origins, constitutional meaning, and continuing global legacy. Our first speaker today is Professor Koen Lenaerts President of the Court of Justice of the European Union, Professor of European Law at KU Leuven, and one of the most respected constitutional jurists in Europe. So thank you very much, Mr. President, for joining us. I'll hand it over to you for your remarks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wouters, dear Dirk, dear colleagues, dear friends. It is a true privilege for me to be associated to this webinar form celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. I must say, like some know, that my academic research has always been in the field of comparing American constitutionalism with EU integration. It was my doctoral dissertation way back in 1982, and on the occasion of a visiting professorship at the Harvard Law School in the spring of 1989, I drafted the essence of that thesis in English under the title Constitutionalism and the Many Faces of Federalism, American Journal of Comparative Law, a piece which is still very much structuring my thinking. Now, you feel immediately that I'm more a constitutionalist, and so a constitution signed on the 17th of September 1787 rather than the Declaration of Independence of the 4th of July 1776. But of course, I also followed the classes of Lawrence Tribe at Harvard, and he has sufficiently inspired us, saying that the Constitution could never have been drafted without the founding principles of the Declaration being laid down 11 years earlier. So the organizers have asked me to focus on three aspects of the Declaration, and I do that with full determination because I think those are the three core aspects to be looked at from a constitutionalism perspective. So first, the Declaration as a claim to political legitimacy and popular sovereignty. Second, the importance of natural rights, the rule of law, and constitutionalism in the Declaration. And third, democracy, rights, and constitutional governance. And I shall now analyze these three aspects, drawing some comparisons with European constitutionalism. Because this comparison, which is, as I said, since more than 45 years, my academic field of research, it's important because European legal thought has influenced the content of the Declaration of Independence, which then in turn subsequently influenced EU constitutionalism in the 19th century. To begin with the Belgian constitution, the country of origin of Dirk, Wouters and myself, but it's not the only one. And so I think it's important to see sort of the two-way street between that. My point is therefore to demonstrate how the Declaration of Independence has set in motion a process in which the United States and the European Union constitutionalism look at each other. It is indeed worth recalling that the founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence were heavily influenced by philosophers from the European Enlightenment, such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and especially John Locke, to name a few. In other words, the liberal ideas of Enlightenment, in its classic understanding, underpin the Declaration of Independence. Now, that brings me to the first aspect, a claim to political legitimacy and popular sovereignty. Why do I begin there? Well, the Declaration of Independence is grounded in the ideas of consent, popular sovereignty, and self-rule. And in fact, it's fair to say that the Declaration of Independence, 4th of July 1776, is the first such exercise after the Magna Carta of 1215, which was an opposition to the king, the need to have a written bill of rights of the people vis-à-vis the king. And then it took several centuries to materialize, so to speak, in the English history. But the Declaration of Independence overseas was in a way a materialization of these same ideas: consent, popular sovereignty, self-rule. So the Declaration of Independence indeed marks the end of the days when the King of England decided the fate of his American subjects. Sovereignty belongs to the people of the United States, who freely and willingly consent to be ruled by a government. And I'm passing here, of course, over the question, which is of huge importance: who is the people? I know the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court of Chief Justice Taney, right? But that's a different subject. But I mean, the idea nevertheless was the king can't do wrong. No, the American people said the king can do wrong, and we don't want to be ruled by a king. Hey, where did I hear that recently? No king demonstrations. That's only a footnote. So, sovereignty belongs to the people of the United States, who freely and willingly consent to be ruled by a government. Governments, and here I quote literally the Declaration of Independence, derive their just powers from the consent of the government. End of quote. This idea of consent, sovereignty, and self-rule is juxtaposed to that of tyranny and opposed to that of tyranny. A tyrant destroys the capacity of free women and men to adopt their own laws, dissolves the representative houses repeatedly, and levies taxes without the consent of his own people. And when you read in the Federalist Papers, these newspaper articles which were written in support of the ratification processes in the 13 states, and as you know, 12 ratified with the exception of Rhode Island and Providence plantations, as it was called at the time, but they stepped over that, as you all know, and then they fell in line later on. But in these Federalist Papers, you find the inspiration of the Declaration of Independence, when Madison is cautioning against the tyranny of the majority. Also, the minority belongs to the people, and their fundamental human rights need to be respected at all times, which was basically the preparation of Marbury versus Madison, 1803, that the Congress can do wrong. Compare with the English law, common law, saying the king can't do wrong and later Parliament can't do wrong. Reason why even today you don't have judicial review of the parliamentary acts of Westminster. But you do have judicial review against a written constitution. Hey, that also doesn't exist in England, by the Supreme Court. So that is really what stems from this idea of the government which must consent, and it is the whole of the people who matter in that regard. So more generally, the idea of consent goes hand in hand with that of political responsibility, and that still applies today. The power of the people to vote those in power out of office is without a shadow of a doubt as important when the declaration was signed as it is today. And when you lose the elections, they're not necessarily tricked, right? Or stolen. When those in power are not subject to political responsibility of any kind and seek to remain in power indefinitely, passing arbitrary laws, tyranny arises. And we see sufficient autocrats around the world now to prove that. The absence of political accountability of any kind justifies, in view of the drafters of the Declaration, that the American people decided to pursue their own path towards life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is still in the preamble of the US Constitution. Especially the pursuit of happiness has always been appealing to me. And I know it was also appealing to Chief Justice Roberts. We were in the same class of Lawrence Tribe, constitutional law at Harvard Law School, having exactly the same age as the Chief Justice. So accountability becomes a key component of any government that wishes to exercise just power on free women and men. And that is really, in its present-day term, in its modern terminology, way 500 years behind the Magna Carta. In its present formulation, it's the Declaration of Independence. The second aspect relates to natural rights, the rule of law, and constitutionalism as a concept of governance in the Declaration. The raison d'être of any government is, and I quote, to secure the safety and the happiness of the people. You can read it in so many words in the Declaration. Again, the Declaration of Independence gives us the foundations of US, but also of European constitutionalism, in that the idea of establishing a government must always be based on a social contract, le contrat social, between the governed and the governors. On the one hand, citizens consent to be ruled by a government that somehow monopolizes power, in particular, the power of coercion. But on the other hand, a government rules not because of a divine justification or because of a bloodline, but because it has the mission of ensuring certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the wording of the Declaration. As we all know, in the US Constitution, and also in the 14th Amendment to that Constitution, it became life, liberty, and property, which is in line with Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, the sort of core essence of the human rights. Today, this idea of social contract underpins all constitutions in democratic societies. That is precisely why constitutions have to be ratified by representatives of the people or by the peoples themselves in a referendum. This, by the way, also applies for the treaties founding the European Union as a common governance structure to 27 member states, as a common legal order. Each member state accedes to the Union and commits itself to upholding the obligations flowing from the treaties in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. That sort of corresponds, even if the US Constitution starts with "we the people," it was not "we the people," it were 13 representatives of the states concerned, which thereafter each one ratified in accordance with their own constitutional requirements. It's almost a copy-paste of the present Article 49 of the Treaty on the European Union here in Europe. So Article 49. And of course, it also means at the European level that this popular consent to European integration also holds true, even if it's a sad sequence, that the member state can leave the Union. Brexit, as I said, is politically a sad development in the eyes of many, including myself speaking as a private person, but it underscores what I'm just saying. The fact that Article 50 allows, and we specify that in our Whiteman full court judgment of December 2018, it's an exercise of popular sovereignty of the member states of the European Union to accede or to withdraw. And for that reason, Article 49, accession, is followed by Article 50, retreating from the European Union. So the contrat social is still very much there. In the light of the Declaration of Independence, one may convincingly argue that governments must put the human condition center stage. And allow me to quote in full the most famous sentence of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, US scholars and politicians have argued that the Declaration of Independence and later the US Constitution suffered from the original sin of slavery. However, that sin was later corrected when the Reconstruction Amendments were passed. I would add that the Declaration of Independence, and in particular that sentence, gave impetus to political movements such as the civil rights movement and the right of women to vote, because they wanted the US to live up to the promise of its own creed, that is to say that all men and all women are created equal. Equal dignity means precisely that all men and women are created equal. That also reflects the value of human dignity, which is the first value on which the European Union is founded, and which we recently fleshed out in a landmark full court judgment of the 21st of April 2026, commissioned against Hungary, when it came to the compatibility of a Hungarian law equating LGBTQ plus community people with those convicted of pedophilia. And we said this marginalization, stigmatization, marginalization, and association with criminals is, of course, excluding a person from the society. So that is against the Declaration of Independence, equality between all people as they are born. So that is, in my view, still the leftover. Respect for the rule of law also underpins the Declaration of Independence. I referred already to Marbury versus Madison. The fact that this equality can only be achieved through a government of laws, not of man, like it is beautifully carved out on Langdale Hall of the Harvard Law School. That's exactly it. It's the famous sentence of John Adams, as everyone knows. And I shall here quote the declaration saying, the founding fathers object to the King of England that, I quote, he has obstructed the administration of justice, that he has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries, and that he is depriving Americans of the benefits of trial by jury. So these were recriminations in the Declaration of Independence against the King of England. Now, these recriminations of criticisms are the core essence of what the social contract in the US Constitution, but also in the EU treaties and in the national constitutions of the member states of the European Union, to be able to become a member state in the first place, are resting on. That is, checks and balances enforced by an independent judiciary and based on a written constitution. Last, democracy and the Declaration of Independence flows from anything which I have said so far. We can discuss it in our question and answer, but I have said the essence. Democracy is not tantamount to the tyranny of the majority. The tyranny of the majority, which says that the majority, the 51% who elect the president, so to speak, and the 49 others, they are enemies of the people. That is not democracy. Democracy is the demos kratein. The demos is the whole of the population. Democracy is an inclusive concept, and democracy without protecting the human rights of the minorities, in whatever respect they are seen as a minority, cannot operate. The freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to say in the press that you disagree with the president and why that is so, without risking to be prosecuted for hundreds of millions of damages claims, which then you settle for a few 10 of millions. That is not a freedom of expression. It is not what we here in the European perspective are validating. I can flesh that out further in the debate, but I think that the ideals which underpin the Declaration of Independence are no longer taken for granted, not in the United States, not in several European states, and therefore it is important that we as an academic community in Europe and in the United States go on defending these values against the tide. The founding fathers have defended these values against the King of England, and we know the history. I've traced it very rapidly here, and we will hear more about it. But it remains also a challenge today to uphold these values against the powers that be today. In the United States, in Europe, the power of big tech, the powers that be. The people are center stage. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the protection of minorities against the tyranny of the majority. That's for me the lasting legacy of the Declaration of Independence, further complemented with the US Constitution and with the Marbury versus Madison line of case law and many things which ensued. The United States in that respect remains a lighthouse for European integration based on constitutionalism, a government under laws, not under man. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now with that rich contribution, we'll move to our second speaker. So our second speaker is Professor David Armitage, a professor of history at Harvard University and author of The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, one of the most influential studies of the Declaration's international impact. So thank you so much, Professor Armitage, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Catherine, and it's a true honor to join such distinguished colleagues at this moment of commemoration and celebration. As a historian, I want to take us back to the steamy summer of 1776 in Philadelphia to ask the question, what exactly was it that the Declaration of Independence declared? And having once declared it, what then were the international, indeed global, consequences of that declaration? I have 15 minutes to cover 250 years of global history, so forgive me if I speak rather rapidly. The first thing to say is the declaration was not a necessary document. The Continental Congress did not have to declare independence on the 4th of July, 1776. Because they had voted for independence on the 2nd of July, 1776. On that day, the Congress, by overwhelming majority, had approved Richard Henry Lee's resolution, quotes, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be fully dissolved. Formally, that vote on the 2nd of July carried the delegates to the Continental Congress across the Rubicon. And indeed, John Adams famously wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail Adams, saying that forevermore, in perpetuity, the United States will celebrate the 2nd of July as its birthday, with guns and celebrations and festivals. And in a fundamental legal sense, he was absolutely right. That was the vote for independence. But Congress had already decided that it was necessary to declare independence, that is, to justify and explain why they had taken that vote, why they had taken this momentous decision to exit from the British Empire, to secede from the British Empire, to engage in what we might now call the first formal act of decolonization in world history. So why did they do this? Why did they feel they had to do this? First of all, in the late 18th century, public opinion, including international public opinion, was becoming central to the practice of politics, at least in the Atlantic world. It was also a highly saturated media environment. The circulation of print was essential to the formation of that public opinion and also the swaying of that public opinion with reasoned argument. And so the Declaration of Independence was a very explosive piece of print inserted into that media environment precisely to shape what the Declaration itself calls the opinions of mankind, and to present the full roster of fundamental arguments to a candid world, giving the legal facts on which the vote for independence was based. You'll recall that out of the 1,300 words of the Declaration, about 1,000 of those words amount to the charges against King George himself. It's worth remembering here, President Lenaerts has already mentioned Blackstone, that Blackstone defines a declaration as the count which is given in court against a plaintiff, laying out the precise charges which are brought the plaintiff before the court. And that is exactly what the Declaration does for the bulk of its verbiage, is to lay out the charges against the king himself in the court of international public opinion. So that's what the Declaration was meant to do at that moment. I'll specify a bit more some of the larger ramifications of that in just one moment. It is worth observing that the Declaration of Independence nowhere uses the word independence. It speaks of free and independent states very frequently. Indeed, free and independent states are printed and also then written in the famous manuscript version of the Declaration in capital letters. All caps was not an invention of Twitter or social media. It had been invented for the Declaration of Independence. The word independence is not mentioned there. Free and independent states, I put a lot of emphasis on that because those words are effectively a quotation from the single most important Enlightenment thinker of whom most people have not heard, and I'm sure my distinguished panelists know him well. That is the Swiss Neuchâtelois jurist Emma de Vattel, who in his Law of Nations, the very, very influential Handbook of the Law of Nations of 1758, he specifies that an international person, a state, a nation, is distinguished like natural persons in the state of nature by its freedom and independence. And he repeats over and over again the formula: free and independent, freedom and independence, free and independent states. Richard Henry Lee's original resolution contains those Vattellian words. Those Vattellian words are the conclusion, the QED, as it were, of the logic of the Declaration. And for my money, I think Vattel is the single most important shaping influence from the European Enlightenment on the document, just to pick up one of the very important threads that President Lenaerts laid out for us. And we know also, thanks to Benjamin Franklin, that Vattel's Law of Nations was the only book that we can document that we know to have been on the desks of the drafters of the Declaration. Not Rousseau, not Voltaire, not Montesquieu, not Locke, but Vattel. I am the unofficial president of the Vattel Society, so I always have to bring him into these discussions. Also strikingly, the absence of the word independence. Alongside that, the word American is used nowhere in the document, neither as a noun nor as a verb. The British Crown is mentioned, the present King of Great Britain is mentioned, our British brethren are mentioned strikingly. There are lots of British people in the Declaration, but there are no Americans. United States of America, yes, but not yet any Americans. I think that's even more significant. This was not a revolution which took part on behalf of pre-existing Americans. Remember the famous, perhaps apocryphal quotation attributed to the Italian politician Massimo d'Azeglio after Italian unification. He said then, you'll recall, we have made Italy, now we must make Italians. I think we can say exactly the same thing about United States history. The United States had been made possibly in 1776, but it would take at least a century for a consensual, collective national idea of what America was and who Americans were. That is, it took until after the cataclysm, the divisive cataclysm of the Civil War. It's also after the Civil War when the noun United States becomes a singular noun rather than a plural noun as well. And I think those two things are very much related. So what was it again in practical terms that the Declaration was meant to do in 1776? Number one, it was meant to allow former British colonists to become at least potentially citizens of new polities. 3 of the former colonies had already ratified constitutions before 1776, and the others would, of course, follow in the succeeding months. These new polities, the individual states, 13 of them, would now have citizens rather than subjects, and the Declaration is announcing that fact both domestically and internationally. Secondly, thinking on the international stage, the Declaration transformed rebels within the British Empire, against whom, of course, domestic police action could take place, into legitimate fighters, belligerents outside the British Empire, a crucial legal transformation in the status of those who were leading and also fighting in the Revolutionary War on the Patriot side. Thirdly, and relatedly, the Declaration transformed a British civil war, the last British civil war, in fact, into a war between the powers of the earth, what we would now call an interstate or international war. That language of civil war is used by everybody across the political spectrum on both sides of the Atlantic in 1774, 75, and 1776, a war within the British Empire among fellow Britons, and a war of local civil wars in colonies, now states such as New York and South Carolina, and a civil war which even cleaved families down the middle as well. So a series of interlocking civil wars, but now on the international stage transformed into a war between free and independent states, the United States on one hand and the United Kingdom of Great Britain on the other. And then fourthly and finally, what the Declaration was meant to do was, again, to reiterate what its conclusion stated, that these former United Colonies were now free and independent states. That declaration that they were free and independent states was the first such declaration in world history. The American Declaration was the first declaration of independence as such in world history, and all subsequent declarations of independence, of which there have been hundreds, both successful and failed, can trace their ancestry back to this single primal document. Whatever its significance in American history is, I think that is its fundamental significance in global history, is creating what I've called the genre of a Declaration of Independence, in particular creating that as a legal genre, which has a trajectory through world history, which I'll track in just one second. It was, of course, what international lawyers would now call a unilateral Declaration of Independence at that point. It could not guarantee either secession or recognition, as the late great international lawyer James Crawford put it. A unilateral declaration issued by persons within a state is a collection of words writ in water. It is the sound of one hand clapping, and that was true of the US Declaration itself. It could not by itself, of course, transform those United Colonies into independent states. As a contemporary pamphlet, co-authored in fact by Jeremy Bentham, the budding great legal philosopher of the time, in 1776 put it, it's one thing for Congress to say the connection which bound them to Great Britain is dissolved, another to dissolve it. That to accomplish their independence is not quite so easy as to declare it. Under the prevailing norms of the time, it was rather like the character Michael Scott in the American version of The Office, declaring bankruptcy, standing up among his fellows and saying, I declare bankruptcy. And one of his fellow office mates says, you can't just stand up and say I'm bankrupt. And he replies, I didn't say I was bankrupt, I declared that I am bankrupt. But of course, it has no legal effect. And legally, the declaration itself could have no legal effect in 1776. According to the contemporary, rather fluid, but still contemporary international norms of the law of nations at that point, this was, we might say, 7 years premature, because the understanding at that period in the 1770s, 1780s was that independence could only be granted by the former sovereign. It could not be claimed by any seceding or rebellious people. That is, as international lawyers would now say, state recognition was held to be constitutive, not declaratory. It simply couldn't be proclaimed, but had to be confirmed by the former incumbent power. That, of course, only happened in September 1783 with the first article of the Peace of Paris, which formally ended the American War of Independence. And I would argue, at least if we're going to be an originalist about the Constitution, we should be an originalist about the Declaration. And according to the norms of the law of nations in the late 18th century, it was only in 1783 with Article 1 when His Britannic Majesty acknowledged the said United States to be free, sovereign, and independent states that they became such. So I'm here to say we're actually here 7 years too early. In defiance of all knowledge of the law of nations in the late 18th century, Americans persist in celebrating the 4th of July when they should be celebrating the 3rd of September, and we should be waiting till 2033 to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the genuine moment of American independence and the proper semi-quincentennial. So, to be less facetious just for a moment, declarations of independence beginning in 1776 and for most of their subsequent history have generally been announcements of exit from empires and from similar political bodies. For one people to become separate by dissolving the political bands which have connected them with another and assuming among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. That's what declarations of independence do. The goal of Jefferson and his fellow authors and of the Continental Congress was to create free and independent states outside the British Empire, precisely in order to gain diplomatic and military and commercial support from the other powers of the earth, especially but not only from France, but also the Netherlands, particularly financial and commercial support from the Netherlands. And in this sense, as I've written elsewhere, the Declaration of Independence was centrally a declaration of interdependence with the other powers of the earth. The document is mostly written, at least its opening and closing paragraphs were deliberately written in the patois of the Law of Nations circa 1776, precisely to persuade the other powers of the earth that this was not a revolutionary state in the sense of a state which was going to upset or overturn the existing international order and its norms. It was going to enter that existing international order according to the reigning norms of that order, that is, the contemporary Law of Nations, hence in part speaking in Vatelian language. This leads in due course, of course, to the treaties of amity and commerce with France of February 1778 and other alliances and support from European powers. And again, if we fast forward to the period of 1783 and immediately afterwards, it was very evident to contemporaries what was revolutionary about the American Revolution. This great American Revolution, this recent political phenomenon of a new sovereignty arising among the sovereign powers of the earth, will be attended to and contemplated by all nations, said the president of Yale in a sermon, Ezra Stiles, in 1784. Outside the USA, the physical document, spread rapidly and started to generate that genre of a declaration of independence from Europe to the Caribbean to South America and then to Africa. Beginning, of course, I'm happy to be able to say this at this event, the first declaration of independence outside the Americas was in Flanders in 1790, the Flemish declaration against the Austrian Habsburgs at that point. In July 1776, the world historical potential of the Declaration was not yet self-evident, but the centuries that followed demonstrated the wide appeal of its principles and the form, but more often, at least in terms of declarations of independence, more often it was about the rights of states rather than the rights of individuals. So I think there are two faces to the Declaration, especially on its global itinerary. Two conspicuous exceptions to that overarching rule, I think, are the Liberian Declaration of Independence, which directly quotes the second paragraph of the American Declaration and then specifies the only Declaration of Independence which does so: life, liberty, and the right to acquire, hold, and possess property. Enormously important for the Liberian population because, of course, they were emancipated, formerly enslaved people who themselves had been property and were now asserting their right not to be property but to possess property. The other Declaration of Independence, which directly quotes the second paragraph, is, of course, the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence of 1945, which begins with the words, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those are the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And then Ho Chi Minh went on to finesse that by saying this immortal statement made in the American Declaration of 1776, in a broader sense, means that all peoples on earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy, and to be free. And thereby Ho Chi Minh deliberately transforms the Declaration into a charter for post-war decolonization. So 250 years on from 1776, what can we learn about declarations after hundreds have been issued? First, that declarations of independence are public and customarily published to the world. Second, that they usually speak in the voice of one people, seeking to dissolve the political bands connecting them with another. And third, that those declarations of independence, later declarations, almost always assert that the political body or bodies assumed by such a people are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and thereby able to do all acts and things which independent states may of right do. These were features found, for example, in the 1918 Czechoslovak Declaration of Independence, the Korean Declaration of Independence the following year, and transmuted according to shifting norms of recognition and the proliferation of international institutions. We can find versions of those aspects in the Kosovo Declaration of Independence of 2008, the South Sudan's Declaration of Independence of 2011, the first declaration you can watch on YouTube. And then Catalonia's Declaration of Independence of 2017, of course, a failed declaration, a unilateral declaration. All of those documents, and many, many more from world history, which I don't have time to allude to here, attest to the global significance of the American Declaration of 1776, not because most of them quoted the Declaration or even directly appealed to its values, but because they all showed the necessity, even in our century, of declaring independence, making it known domestically and internationally, of performing such a declaration in public, often ceremonially, at a hinge moment, which marks a from to in the political identity of a group of people, and in justifying independence. Now, in 1943, just to conclude, the Trinidadian historian and politician Eric Williams wrote, quotes, "The emergence of the United States on the stage of the nations of the world was itself accomplished only by an overthrow of the colonial system. The spirit of 1776 is alive today," said Williams in 1943. Following him, we might say that decolonization began around 1776, with declarations of independence becoming over the centuries among one of the most conspicuous markers of the process of decolonization. In our world where there are still remnants of empire and also drives for self-determination, that spirit of 1776 remains alive and well, just as declarations of independence remain indispensable instruments to animate that spirit politically and internationally. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, both for the kind of context and significance of the declaration. Perhaps not for the suggestion to move the celebration to the 3rd of September, though. So our final speaker is Professor Alan Henrikson, Professor of Diplomatic History Emeritus at the Fletcher School, Tufts University, and a distinguished scholar of diplomatic history, transatlantic relations, and the Atlantic community. So over to Professor Henrikson for his remarks. Oh, you're just on mute. Oh, sorry, Professor Henrikson, you're on mute.
Good. Am I audible? Good.
We can hear you now.
Thank you. I was mentioning that I was asked earlier if I would address the question, how did the Declaration reshape relations across the Atlantic, and what does it continue to mean for the Atlantic community today? A few words about this notion of reshape. I don't think that the Declaration itself gave any particular form to the transatlantic relationship. What it did initially was profoundly to affect the balance, and that was more prospective than actual. Thomas Paine, in his remarkable pamphlet, Common Sense, which had such a profound influence in various ways, one of the points that he makes, I'd like to quote just a brief passage. "In no instance hath nature made the satellite larger than the primary planet. And England and America, with respect, have reversed the common pattern. This small island controlled, at least nominally, this huge continent, which not only Paine himself, but Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Washington, and others. Washington, after all, was an explorer of territories in the West. They could see prospectively that there was going to be a huge mass of gravitational force in the New World, in the North American part of it. So this notion of power, which can be conceived of and is conceived of in juridical terms as a state, which is actually in the wording of the first part of the Declaration, refers to assuming among the powers of the earth, which is, after all, a physical reference, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. This was a period when Jefferson, all of the Enlightenment thinkers in America and in Europe were thinking in terms of Newtonian physics, laws of gravitation. And this, I think, had a profound influence on the sense of America's potential power in the world, in economic terms. And of course, it's related, according to Newton's laws, it's related to the factor of distance. George Washington, in his farewell address, refers to the distance between Europe and America. And why not take advantage of the fact of this physical separation? So the separateness that was asserted, that was declared with the Declaration of Independence, was something that existed in geographical reality. There was, of course, also a great deal of connection, maritime. I happen to be speaking now from Christmas Cove, Maine, on the coast. Captain John Smith, the British explorer, spent anchored here on Christmas Day in the year 1614. And this maritime relationship, which the colonies were very much a part of, in fact, one of the arguments for independence was that they were being restricted by the Navigation Acts in accordance with principles of mercantile economics, and wanted to be able to trade freely with other countries as well, to break through the shackles of these artificial constraints that were linking American economic resources to particularly Great Britain. There's quite an influential work by Max Savelle, who argues, with reference to this notion of the colonial balance of power, that this also was part of Enlightenment thinking, that the colonies, the resources of the colonies, mainly bullion, gold and silver and so on, would provide ultimately the financial resources to enable the powers of Europe, the governments of Europe, to arm themselves, to strengthen themselves in their contest with each other. So there was a profound economic doctrinal, and also with reference to Newtonian physics, a sense of the potential of the New World. And that was just simply a fact, I think, which was generally recognized. Of course, the fact of the rebellion was very clear, too. George III had already acknowledged that after Lexington and Concord, that the Americans were in rebellion, and therefore the only way to put it down was with physical force. Now, the Atlantic community, that concept, I think, is probably best defined by the American journalist and public philosopher Walter Lippmann. In 1917, actually, he wrote an article in the New Republic about the defense of the defense of the Atlantic world. And what he argued was that the Atlantic was a kind of community of fate, that no one country within the Atlantic basin no matter where it was, no matter how large or small, could protect itself, could provide for its own security by itself alone. But the Atlantic community was more than just a strategic community. It was also, as he argued, something based on kindred connection, um, a legacy of not only Enlightenment thought, but common law to which there has been reference. And he developed this notion more fully in a book that he wrote during World War II, called U.S. Foreign Policy Shield of the Republic. And he went on later, in the 1950s and afterward, to argue that there was a pluralism in the Atlantic community, that he saw within the broader community a united Europe could arise, which he saw as a kind of a third force, which could provide a stabilizing influence in the much larger context of the Atlantic community, in fact, in the context of the world. He was very critical of what became known, owing to George Kennan, the State Department planner, as the containment doctrine, because this could result in what he considered a kind of global crusade, which would mean that the United States would find itself allied with tribes, with factions in parts of the world that had really very little to do with the natural interests of the countries of the Atlantic community. Now, what I would like to suggest, and this may be a bit provocative, is that this notion of national independence, the declarations of national independence, are dangerous. That's a dangerous concept, not only for the monarchies, for the empires of the world, but for the empires themselves. And I'd like to refer, if I may just briefly, to a remarkable 4th of July message that John Quincy Adams gave, in which he pointed out that whereas the standard of freedom and independence have been or shall be unfurled, there will be America's heart, her understanding and her prayers. But she, America, goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that wherever foreign banners are raised, even in the name of independence, it would be a mistake for Americans to involve themselves, because they would become inextricably connected. And as a result, what would be substituted instead of support for independence would be what he called an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster the murky radiance of dominion and power. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. Reference has been made to the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Lyndon Johnson, following President Kennedy, found himself and the country deeply involved in support of the Republic of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, as it was formerly called. And he argued the United States has no interest in territory. All it is interested in is defending the right of the people of South Vietnam, the country of South Vietnam, to defend itself. And he argued that this was of universal importance because other countries around the world considered that if the United States does not stand firm there, it might not be trustworthy in other places as well. Now, of course, there was some reference here to the SEATO Treaty, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which referred to South Vietnam as a free territory within the state of Vietnam. It was only a protocol state, so the United States actually had no formal obligation. Now, these treaties of alliance, which were clearly part of the purpose of the Declaration of Independence, to be able to form them. Thomas Paine, in his Common Sense, made this very clear, that if the Americans did not publicly declare their independence, the aid that the French were giving the Americans might possibly be used in order to strengthen the position of the Americans in negotiating reconciliation with Britain. But by making a declaration, they made an irrevocable commitment. And that resulted in, after the Battle of Saratoga in particular, which was a victory, that resulted in the negotiation of treaties, a treaty of amity and commerce with France, and also a defensive pact with the two of them. And George Washington, in his farewell address, argued that the great rule of conduct for the United States, for us in regard to foreign nations, is in extending our commercial relations, which arguably was the primary interest, actually, of the Americans at the time, in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible, so far as already formed engagements exist, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. That, of course, refers to the treaties with the Amity and Commerce Treaty, the Defensive Pact with France, and also the Pinckney's Treaty with Spain in 1795. But from 1800 on, after the Convention of Montfontaine, the United States had no alliances with any other country until the 1947 Rio de Janeiro Treaty and then the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949. Basically, the United States was a neutral country during that period. Franklin Roosevelt said, and this was said similarly by Woodrow Wilson earlier, neutrals are powers at interest, are parties at interest in modern war. And in some respects, the United States was playing the role during that long period comparable to the role that Russia, Prussia, and Austria played during the American Revolution when they formed the League of Armed Neutrality. It wasn't until 1949 when the United States actually joined in what became in 1950 NATO, so that the Atlantic community was given a shape which it did not have. Prior to that time, it was an area of commerce, it was a maritime field, but it didn't have anything other than a kind of gravitational pull back and forth. But the NATO treaty did give it actually a shape, and arguably, the Declaration of Independence was an international treaty, and insofar as it resulted in the formation of formal treaties with particularly France, it set a pattern for what later became the formalized Atlantic community that we know today.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your remarks and also leaving us some time for questions. So there are a few overarching questions that I'd in particular like to ask the panelists. So I'll pose two questions and then we'll kind of go in speaker order, give each speaker 2 to 3 minutes or so to answer these. And then I already see that there are some questions submitted by our audience via the Q&A function. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to submit them via that function, and I'll do my best to ask as many as possible to get the expertise of our panelists in addressing them. So the two overarching questions I have are, one, which aspects of the Declaration have had the most enduring legacy? The constitutional principles, its revolutionary example, or its international influence? And two, Which aspects of the Declaration remain most useful and pertinent to address, for example, the current situation of polarization in the United States and other countries? So those are some two overarching questions. And I'll first turn to President Lenaerts for your reflections and then move to the other speakers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Nash. I think it will not surprise you that I'm saying that from my perspective, the constitutional principles come to mind. It has been said by Professor Armitage before that this declaration is in fact to a major extent criticisms against the absolute power of the English king. And in this sort of criticism against something which you no longer want, this is a very strong way of expressing what positively should be a modern understanding of governance. That is representative democracy, where the governing power is delegated by the people, represented by those in power. But also the power needs to be exercised under laws which are more important than the powers themselves. And that's the idea of a constitution. Why is a constitution so well protected, so to speak, in terms of the hierarchy of norms? Simply because the constitution rests on a more fundamental level of democratic approval. It is a referendum, or it is a huge parliamentary majority, or it is a ratification in each one of the 13 states at the time. So the constitution is really the social contract. And that can be seen for the first time at that level in the Declaration of Independence. And we in Europe, we live by that. And through the treaties, as I said, on which the European Union is founded, and within the member states, which all need to be democratic states based on the rule of law and respectful of human rights, to be able to join the Union. So that is what Bruce Ackerman, our Yale Law School constitutionalist colleague, calls a constitutional moment. A member state acceding to the European Union goes through a moment of constitutional alignment with the values common to all states, all the member states of the European Union, as these values are further concretized in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That is, in a way, the way to safeguard pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, and solidarity. Three concepts which you find in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union as one of the 12 values on which the Union is based. Traces of all these values are already present in the Declaration of Independence, a declaration which says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but that applies to the whole of the people as it was understood at the time, not only to the majority, which can sort of sway the masses like you would have it in fascist regimes, that the majority says, well, I represent the people because I have a majority, and the minority are enemies of the people. That is not the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. So this declaration is a declaration, in my view, as a call for the rule of law, which legitimizes a government of laws, not of man.
Thank you so much, Professor Armitage.
Well, I'd strongly affirm that everything that President Lenaerts has said in the context of the United States as well. It is very important to remind at least some of our current governors in the United States of the necessity of adhering to precisely those principles which the president so beautifully and strikingly drew out of the declaration for the European context, for all democratic communities, but we should also bring it back to the US as well. That's, I think, partly answering your second question, Catherine, about what might be most useful now. I say it's particularly useful to be reminded of that, and in particular of the enumeration of rights in the second paragraph, because really for the first time in almost 150 years in United States history, we are seeing influential political voices denying the fundamentality of the values of the Declaration, particularly those enumerated in the second paragraph for American life. We have a senior Republican senator about a year ago saying America was not founded on an idea. It is not informed by an idea, let alone, and here I quote him, let alone by a line from the Statue of Liberty or 5 words from the Declaration of Independence. We haven't heard voices like that, maybe occasionally in the segregation era, but not full-throatedly since the run-up to the Civil War and the ideologists of the Confederacy. This is a moment where what we had assumed to be a fundamental consensus in American political and civic life around those fundamental values is beginning to fracture. And therefore, it is a very important moment to remember those values. That, however, I think, again, putting my historian's hat on just for one moment to answer your first question, which parts of the Declaration have been most influential? I think, again, on the global stage, what has been most directly influential is the modular form of a Declaration of Independence. Of all the archive of declarations of independence issued since 1776, most imitate the opening and closing paragraphs. A handful, a couple I specified, refer to the second paragraph. Some have a list of charges, others against a former colonial power, a tyrant, a monarch, an empire. Others issue separate manifestos, they're usually called, particularly in the Spanish-American independence movements. But I think the modularity of the Declaration, that it can be broken down into pieces, recombined with other parts, both of the US Declaration, of later declarations, and of other legal instruments, has given it a flexibility, which, as I mentioned, has made it the key vehicle and instrument for anti-colonial and anti-imperial movements, as well as making it a key document for movements of resistance, rebellion, and other forms of movement on behalf of the rule of law and precisely those values that President Lenaerts mentioned. Recall, just in conclusion, that the Declaration says that human beings are endowed with certain rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That list is not meant to be exhaustive. It may highlight the most important and fundamental ones, but it is not exhaustive. It leaves it open for the enumeration of further rights through time, according to change with different perspectives. It's not an exhaustive list, but it is a fundamental list. And so I would agree with that emphasis for now, for the future.
Thank you so much. Professor Henrikson, what are your views? Still on mute.
There's something very specific in the Declaration that I think should possibly be more noted now, and it does relate to polarization in the United States. Arguably the dominant issue now in American politics is the question of immigration. And that relates to the point about citizenship that Professor Armitage mentioned, that with the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of the American state, it became possible for colonists to become citizens of a new polity. One of the charges in the Declaration, which really caught my eye, he, that is George III, that is the present King of Great Britain, he's not mentioned by name, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands, of property, and there was a lot of property that could be available for settlement at that time. That resonates with me now because the present U.S. government, under the present President of the United States, is carrying out arguably a program to restrict immigration to the United States. There is a wave of lawsuits to denaturalize citizens who have come as immigrants, who have obtained citizenship that way, on grounds that perhaps they concealed some of their past history that might have disqualified them if they weren't of good moral character. The fees for persons coming to the U.S. now, seeking naturalization, have been increased. So there is a restriction now which does fundamental violence to the concept of America, not just as an asylum, but as a home for peoples from all over around the world. The American people are not an ethnicity. They're a combination. It's something new in the face of the world. And citizenship is something, it does derive from the consent of the governed. And President Lenaerts mentioned the correlation between the consent of the governed, popular sovereignty, the consent of the governed, and responsibility. That those in authority need to be accountable to the people. And at present in the United States, if I may be a bit political, we are not seeing responsibility being exercised at the executive level, at the congressional level, or arguably even at the judicial level, in accordance with the structure of the Constitution, which does compare in very interesting ways with the structure of the European Union, as President Lenaerts has explained in his comparative analysis. So this notion of citizenship is something that I think is generally not associated with the Declaration of Independence, but it is something very much in question now in the United States. The very nature of the composition of American society and how it came to be what it is and how it might be changed in the future with the increased immigration of persons from not only Mexico, Central America, but many, many other parts of the world as well.
And thank you so much for your reflections on kind of those broad questions. We have a few questions from our audience. Professor Armitage, you kind of mentioned in your remarks kind of a historical understanding of some of the issues that are pertinent for the Declaration. And we have a question: how can democracies respond effectively to new civil democracy through social media, opinion polling, petitions, etc.? Are these undermining the concept of representative rather than direct democracy? I wonder if with your historian hat on, if you could kind of reflect on some of those new issues, but maybe some that have historic parallels.
Oh my goodness, how long do we have?
12 minutes.
12 minutes indeed. That's asking me to be more of a political theorist, I think, than a historian. In fact, I mean, I would revert to the historian mode just for a moment and reiterate what I said, that the Declaration is a product of a peculiar and particular media environment in the late 18th century, which of course is very different from our contemporary media environment. There are moves even in some national parliaments now, not only to allow electronic voting within the chambers. I was just in the Westminster Parliament a couple of weeks ago. They have electronic voting there now, of course, but also to allow the population at large, the demos itself, to perhaps begin tentatively to vote on matters of national interest or on particular pieces of legislation, or at least informing particular debates around legislation. That social media, if we're looking at it optimistically for one moment at least, might open up the possibility for more direct, more genuinely direct democracy. To repurpose a phrase from elsewhere, we could imagine a daily plebiscite on the issues of the day, on legislative matters, on matters of political debate, where the population is polled regularly on its views, what that would do to representatives in a representative democracy, and how that would reshape both the theory and the practice of direct democracy, is a very, very different matter, of course, and one far beyond my competence, except as a citizen. I'm a subject of King Charles and a citizen of the United States simultaneously, so I might wear two hats to consider that. But I think the media environment within which central legal instruments are born and within which fundamental values are propagated is not at all irrelevant to the shape and the trajectory and the future and the purchase of those values as well. And that, of course, has changed very radically between 1776 and 2026.
Thank you. Do either of our other speakers have anything to add? Yeah. Oh, you'll just want to unmute yourself, Professor Henrikson.
The effect of social media has to some degree arguably undercut political representation. That persons who have a page on Facebook or on LinkedIn are representing themselves to the world, irrespective of political jurisdictions, irrespective of national boundaries, not necessarily even in connection with communities, Facebook communities, groups of various kinds. And this may have something to do, possibly, with, in a way, the weakening of our political institutions. That members of the House of Representatives, United States senators, don't have the kind of connection through their local offices, for example, that they used to have, because that used to be the way for a citizen to express his or her views nationally. Now it can be done globally in this broadly expansive sphere of social media, which is a continuation. It's a kind of evolution, actually, from what Professor Armitage mentioned when he emphasized the importance of print and documents. I mentioned Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was widely read and read aloud, in pubs around the United States. So it's not something completely new, but it does challenge the constitutional structure of our political system and the role of political parties, which don't function in the disciplinary kind of way that they used to.
Thank you so much. So I'm cognizant of the time. So I have kind of one more question from our audience that I'll pose first to President Lenaerts. And then I'd like to close with each speaker reflecting in just a few sentences on what is the single most important reason why the Declaration of Independence still matters in 2026. And I just wanted to throw that out there now to give you a few moments to think. My first question, though, for President Lenaerts is one of our audience members highlighted that a current threat to representative democracy is the increasing use of legislative powers reserved to the executive. What are some of the norms of the declarations you think that are relevant for this, and how would those kind of norms deal with this issue?
Well, yes. First of all, I fully share the concern of the person having asked that question. And when you see all these, I have here the declaration in front of me, all these criticisms which were launched to the English king at the time, it was precisely that he ruled by executive order, like we would call it today, without implication of the representative assemblies. And so that is one of the core aspects for me, that the governed must, through their representatives, consent to the laws which will thereafter sort of regulate their behavior. So that is when you see, for instance, here, he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. It's only one example, but it is, in fact, what then in Article 3 of the US Constitution saying that the judicial power is vested in one Supreme Court and such lower courts as the Congress may from time to time establish. So that is the legislative power. So it sort of claws back to Article 1. The legislative power is vested in the Congress. And by the way, in the US Constitution, the first 3 articles, they start with the first article, the Congress. The legislative power is vested in the Congress. And then all the enumerated powers of the Congress. It's only the second article, which is the executive, which will be vested in the president, and then the judiciary. So I think this trias politica, understood as the checks and balances between the powers, needs to be upheld. So the question is absolutely right. When you decide by executive order what is incumbent on the legislature, then you need the judicial power to quash the executive orders. But for that, you need a depoliticized, independent Supreme Court and such lower courts as the Congress may from time to time establish. That is why the Court of Justice of the European Union, which I have the honor and the pleasure to preside, has since the last 15 years increasingly exigent case law on the independence of the national courts of the member states, which are called upon to implement union law. And when it comes to executive powers exercised by the European Commission, we will always see whether there is a legislative basis for those executive powers, and if not, the Commission decisions are annulled, invalidated. So that is a strict upholding of the separation of powers, the checks and balances, with a primacy for the legislative powers. And that's in European constitutionalism, also when you take the Bundesverfassungsgericht or the Verfassungsgerichtshof in Austria, or you take the constitutional courts of the new democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. It's always the task of these courts to uphold the primacy of the legislature. Those are elected. It's the first article of the US Constitution. It's fully in line with the spirit of the Declaration. So I think that the present holders of governmental executive powers in the US, but also in Europe, need to be reminded of that. The legislature enjoys primacy.
Thank you. That leads us perfectly into the final question of just what is the single most important reason why the Declaration of Independence still matters in 2026? So we just had an example there. I'll start with Professor Henrikson. I'm going reverse order. If you could just give, 2 or 3 sentences.
What I would like to emphasize most of all is the Declaration of Independence as an expression of rebellious youth. There's a classic article by Eric McKittrick and Stanley Elkins called "The Founding Fathers, Young Men of the Revolution." They were in their 30s. George Washington was older, as was Ben Franklin. These were youth. And there was just an article in the Wall Street Journal by Harvey Mansfield, Emeritus Professor at Harvard, who's in his 90s now, emphasizing that that's what the Declaration of Independence means and should mean. It is the emphasis on young people constantly refreshing, rejuvenating the polity. It isn't something to be simply venerated, it's something to be acted upon anew. One thinks of Thomas Jefferson actually arguing that every 20 years or so, there should be a new revolution, a rebellion of some kind, a kind of Woodstock, if you will, in political form. That I think is and probably should be the enduring meaning of the revolution. It has a refreshing effect. It isn't simply backward looking. It's future oriented. It regenerates, if you will, the American
Thank you.
political tradition, and that's really important.
Absolutely. Professor Armitage, single most important reason. Oh, you're on mute.
I do just want to say, wearing my British hat, that George III was only 5 years older than Thomas Jefferson. They were of exactly the same generation, and they were brought up on exactly the same books. Their favorite reading in both cases was Blackstone and Montesquieu. So anyway, that's a historical point. The historical significance of the Declaration, I think, on a global scale, is that it heralds for the first time the transformation, the political transformation of the international order from a world of empires to a world of states. That transformation is basically complete by this point. There is no polity which, with a straight face, any longer calls itself an empire. Every inch of the Earth's surface, with some conspicuous states of exception, is now blanketed by states. That was a process barely beginning in 1776, but it determines the shape of the democratic polities that we occupy, and I think is the first order ground on which all of the fundamental questions, for instance, about representation and fundamental values and constitutionalism are ultimately built, is on that ground of territorial statehood, and that is perhaps the biggest single political transformation since 1776. The Declaration heralded that, it foreshadowed it, but it also helped very much to effect that transformation from a world of empires to our world of states.
Thank you. And finally, President Lenaerts, the single most important reason why the Declaration still matters in 2026.
Well, I think that Professor Armitage has just mentioned a principal one. We have gone to a world of states. In Europe, however, as you're all aware of, it lasted almost 150 years longer, because the empires were only dissolved after the tragedy of the First World War. And in a way, when these states were then developing in the interbellum, in the period 1919 and following, at national constitutional levels, the Declaration of Independence was very much at the forefront of the liberal democratic state based on a written constitution with a Bill of Rights. That is all that was foreshadowed in the Declaration of Independence. So for me, the Declaration of Independence remains, both in the United States as in Europe, at national level and at the common legal order level of the European Union, a lighthouse for development of a pluralistic and inclusive democracy based on tolerance, solidarity, all the values which we now cherish in Article 2. When you take sort of the different form of time developing, the different wordings, the deep sense is in fact a continuation. So I think, yes, it's a lighthouse for the United States and for Europe in terms of development of constitutionalism, a government under laws, not of man. And I hope that this will consolidate the strength of Atlantic relationships between the United States of America and Europe, which go beyond the term of one or two presidencies, which will always go with ups and downs. But that is conjoncturel, as we say in French. It's conjunctural. It's not fundamental. When you look at the fundamentals which bind the United States and Europe, read the Declaration of Independence and you have understood everything.
Thank you. So all there is to say is on behalf of the organizers, America Europe Fund at KU Leuven, the College of Europe, and Fletcher School. Thank you to Ambassador Wouters, to President Lenaerts, to Professor Armitage, and to Professor Henrikson for a timely and rich discussion. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope that this conversation contributes to a broader reflection on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. And have a good evening. Thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Bye.